Hello everybody and welcome to another session of WMA Talks. Today I have the exciting privilege of interviewing the renowned Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz. But let us first remind ourselves who Rabbi Tatz is. He was born in South Africa, and after practicing as a doctor both in South Africa and in America, he moved to Israel, where he practiced medicine both in hospital and in general medicine, and he also engaged in a number of years of Talmudic study, later teaching Jewish thought and medical ethics in Jerusalem. He now serves as a senior lecturer at the JLE, the Jewish Learning Exchange in London. Rabbi Tatz is the founder and director of the Jerusalem Medical Ethics Forum and has written a number of books which have been translated into Spanish, French, and Portuguese. In fact, Rabbi Tatz, he spent Shabbat at Western Marble Arch just a few months ago, and it was a wonderful experience for our community. And so I'm just so thrilled to be having this conversation with him. So the way this interview will work is first I'm going to ask some of my own questions, and then I will ask some questions which have been submitted to me by members of the community. So Rabbi Tatz, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be with your community.
Thank you, thank you. Over the past few months, how has your role changed as an international Torah educator?
I think there are two main responses to that question. One is technical and one is content. Technically, obviously, being locked up at home, so my role has changed in terms of a medium or mode of communicating with people. Normally, I travel around the world and come face to face with people. I don't shoot till I see the whites of their eyes, if you want to put it that way. Nowadays, we're sitting at home in my study, as you can see, and communicating. So the disadvantage of that is it's a little more difficult to communicate clearly. I would say I've learned that it takes me about twice as long to get through a subject as it does when you can see people's responses. When people are responding in front of you, you can tell whether they're understanding, whether you need to repeat something or not. When you're speaking at a distance, particularly with webinars where you don't see faces on the screen, one needs to proceed more slowly and cautiously. So I find I'm getting through about half the material. The advantage, though, is we can speak to lots more people. So at the JLE, I might have 40, 50 people in the room. On occasion, we've had a couple of hundred people in the room. Now we speak to thousands, both live and on recorded format. So we might have a few hundred people on a Zoom session, and then I get feedback that, thousands of people have accessed that program around the world at various times. People in Australia, New Zealand, Croatia, you name it. So it's a much broader reach. So I think that's been a big advantage of this new phase. In terms of answering your question on the level of content, I've been asked a lot more questions and had to do a lot more research and get up to speed on virology and COVID. What I've tried to do is, having a medical background, I've tried to be a sort of a clearinghouse for technical advances in the COVID situation. So I stay in touch with American doctors, researchers. I was privileged to study with a leading virologist in my own medical career, who's now Professor Emeritus, Professor Barry Shub, and he sends me every few days the latest research news and updates. And so I've been able to answer questions based on, I'm at the intersection between the halachic world and the medical world. So of course I need to be very well informed. So I've been keeping up with the research in COVID, fascinating, new, very challenging illness on the clinical level and epidemiological level. So my life has changed. In response to your question, a lot of what I'm dealing with now is personal questions about risk and COVID. Not easy at all because we're working in the dark largely, but I'd say I'm dealing with that as probably the most common question that I'm asked. People want to know the Jewish approach to risk and the issues that a COVID type situation, risk and isolation. I'll just give you one more insight, if I may.
Please.
Yeah, the real challenge at the moment in this phase of the COVID illness, and I'm sure your viewers and your members will be interested to hear this, the real tension at this moment is the tension between isolation on the one hand, which keeps people safe, but damage to a community on the other hand, economy and damage to a community. And I've been looking into the halachic sources for this, and it seems to be that in Jewish life, we view a community on a sort of a life and death scale where we wouldn't view an individual that way. In other words, to impoverish a community or endanger a community from an economic point of view, in Jewish law seems to have a life and death component. Just to give you one quick example, if two people are in the desert with one bottle of water, the debate there is, do you share the water with your friend or do you drink it yourself? But amazingly, there's a section in the Talmud that talks about 2 towns with a water supply, where if the upstream people drink, there'll be enough water for the downstream people to drink. But if the upstream people drink and do their laundry, the downstream people will have no water to drink at all. And believe it or not, there's a major opinion in the Talmud that the upstream people drink and do their laundry. In other words, now again, there's room to move in this piece of Talmud exactly how dangerous that will be. But the point is, you see, when it comes to community, we can prioritize things that we certainly would not do. There's no way 2 people in the desert, one of them can turn to his friend and say, I really want to wash my shirt, and you don't drink. That's unthinkable. But when it comes to a community, there's a life that a community has that needs to be judged at a different level than individuals. And that's the tension we're experiencing now by maintaining the lockdown. There's a lot more to say about that, of course, but in a nutshell, I would say that's the current issue.
Wow, fascinating, really, and all very real. So next question, which is kind of connected, is, well, it is connected. So many people from all over the world seek your advice about medical halacha. Would you be able to share some interesting COVID-19 examples of this?
Yes. Well, let's give it a context. The information we're waiting for at the moment, there's one overriding piece of medical information that's missing from the puzzle that is far more important than any other at this point in time. And that's the question of whether people who have been infected going forward will be immune. That is the major question that all the politicians and clinicians around the world are waiting for. If it turns out like in most viral illnesses, people who've had the infection are immune, at least in the short term, at least for a few months, that will change the situation radically. It means people who've had convincing symptoms or people who've been tested positive, have antibodies, can go out into the society, start getting the economy going, visit vulnerable people, take care of them, run the medical services effectively, lots of things we can be doing, knowing that those people are safe. If, however, it turns out, and this is one of the great fears about COVID, that people who've been infected can get infected again, that will change this into a long-term nightmare, because it means we can't expose anybody at any level. And therefore, the tension will be between maintaining as powerful a lockdown as we can, with only the essential minimal relaxation of the standards, which is going to require a completely different approach. It also means, by the way, that vaccines are unlikely to be effective. Think about it this way. If you can get infected a second time, though your body has already mounted an immune response, the vaccine is going to be useless because all the vaccine does is stimulate an immune response. And if that's ineffectual, this will be a problem. The evidence that's accumulating is largely in favor of the fact that people, fortunately, thankfully, probably will be immune. We know that there's a strong antibody response, and we know that monkeys who are infected cannot be infected again in the short term. That's circumstantial evidence, and it's not completely convincing. 300 to 400 people around the world now have been positive, tested negative, and been reinfected again. The experts are betting that that is probably not a reinfection, but just a recurrence of the previous infection. But to be honest, nobody really knows. So most of the questions I'm getting, you ask me what's the most common question? The most common question is, can I take the risk? Somebody called me this morning. He wants to travel from Israel to a very close friend's wedding. There'll be a handful of people at the wedding. It's risky. We don't know what the risks will be in the travel, on the plane, the people that he'll mix with. I get calls from vulnerable people. You know, there's a cancer sufferer or somebody with immune compromise. On the other hand, they need to go to hospital for a treatment. You know, I think these are the main issues that the pressing issues that we're dealing with now. I actually wrote a book about this some time ago. It's called Dangerous Disease and Dangerous Therapy. I might as well promote it. And this is a book for doctors, but it largely centers on the question of how we assess risks in Judaism. How much risks are we allowed to take for what sorts of benefits? I think that's probably been the major issue. I'm not in clinical practice. So I'm not dealing with the actual technicalities of, you know, the complications of the disease in a hospital setting. I'm dealing more with the community and family issues. I
was going to ask this question later, but as you brought the topic up, we had this question from Dr. Tony Isaac, who's a member of our shul, and he asked the following question. Elaborate arrangements are being planned for the reopening of shuls designed to ensure a safe environment during the pandemic. The effectiveness of these measures has yet to be tested. The question is, should a person who is considered to be vulnerable on the grounds of age or health factors attend at all until the effectiveness of these measures has been assessed?
That's an excellent question, and Dr. Isaac knows very well how we should view risk in these situations. I'm of the opinion that we should be the last to do that. I think shuls should be open as late as possible. It's quite correct. We don't know about the protective measures and how effective they'll be. I think we don't need to take the lead in opening up community institutions. I think we can afford to wait a little bit to see what the scientific evidence is. I've not forgotten the importance of prayer and communal prayer. Believe me, Rabbi Taylor, I'm just as concerned about that as you are. But I don't think that should be the our initial move. I think personally, probably schools are going to be a safer option than shuls. I may be wrong. The Jerusalem experience recently has called that into question. As you probably know, some children have become infected. But there's general science from around the world has shown that children are much slower to pick up the disease and probably pass it on as well. You probably know that thankfully, the mortality rate and the complication rate in children has been much lower than adults. A number of good studies around the world have shown that even infected kids or infected teachers in a school failed to pass it on among the school community. So I think probably schools are a good place to start. As Rabbi Asher Weiss said recently, we don't need to take the lead in going out there and exposing people in the community. When it comes to the tension between individual infection and community benefits, I think we should err on the side of caution for vulnerable individuals. I think we should be slow to open the shuls. And indeed, I think when we do, we should take extreme protective measures and wait until the science comes in. You probably know that Rabbi Akiva Tatz, during a cholera epidemic, you're going back a couple hundred years, the very same questions were raised. And when they did open up the community, he insisted on no more than 15 people in any synagogue, widely spaced. And he said, if necessary, hire a policeman to stand at the door to make sure other people don't come in. You can have rotas of minyanim, you can have 15 people, and then you can clear the shul and fit it again. So, again, you can't compare cholera in detail to what we're going through now, but certainly halachic precedent, he as a leading rabbinic figure was not anxious to throw open the doors of the shuls and expose people. So in general, I think we should be err on the side of caution. That's my opinion.
How do you think the Jewish community and wider society will emerge differently from this pandemic?
Rabbi Taylor, I have a bit of a cynical view of that, I'm afraid. And I think experience shows that it'll be quickly forgotten, unfortunately. Of course, the suffering families and the grieving families, of course, we'll never forget. And it'll always be part of our history. But unfortunately, people have very short memories. If there will be a technical change, I hope it will be at the level of preparing for another pandemic. You know, the virology community has been saying now, warning governments for a number of years now. You open any leading medical journal for the last 10 years, you'll see dire warnings of exactly this sort of thing. The prediction was that it would be an influenza epidemic, which we have lived through many times before, pandemics, epidemics. The corona story was somewhat of a surprise. There were experts warning about this as well because of the MERS and SARS epidemics that happened over the last 20 years, which had a much higher mortality than this, but fortunately were stopped in their tracks. So I think probably after a convincing episode like this, at least in the shorter term, probably preventive methods and thought will go into preventing another epidemic. But even then, I'm a little cynical because, you know, if it's not a current issue with people dying around you, the political will tends to weaken. So on the negative side, I hate to say it, but I think that within a few months of this experience, things will more or less be back to normal. You know, one of the problems with locking down some countries was that there were areas in which the expert advice was to lock down, and many politicians felt it just wasn't feasible. Unless people see people dying around them, they tend not to take things seriously. So you have expert advice, yes, we need to do it, but if it isn't tangible for people, it's very hard to enforce. So I'd like to think that we'll be more cautious. I'd like to think we'll end up a little bit more religious from this experience. But I hate to say it, although I hate to say it between you and me, unfortunately, I think somewhere down the line, we'll be probably back more or less, maybe feeling the economic effects. But unfortunately, I don't think the world will look too different than it was before the epidemic.
Moving on to a different topic. As somebody who grew up in South Africa, what are your reflections about what is happening in America right now?
You mean the violence and the repercussions? Recent events?
Yes. In the last week or so.
You know, I'm not sure my South African experience is really relevant to that. The racism in South Africa was of a different nature. This will take a long time to go into in detail. You know, South African racism was not so much, or let me put it this way, there was not, I would say, the inveterate hatred across the race barrier was less of an issue in South Africa than a survival issue. You know, at the time when I was, let's say, during my teenage years, there were 5 million white people in South Africa and 40 million black people. The white anxiety wasn't hatred of the black person as a black person. In fact, in traditional Afrikaans society, they got on very well. I mean, it certainly was not an equal relationship, but it was a fear of, you know, a mass, if the lid were lifted and political suppression was removed, you know, the fears were that there'd be a Kenya type massacre, and therefore there was really a sort of a survival issue. So they're different. Of course, there was also a brutal, purely racial hatred as well, but it's not of the same type as you see in the United States. So I'm not sure how much the South African background is really the relevant question here. I think it's just any intelligent person's looking at the situation, and I think you can certainly see why many Americans are angry. You know, American culture is has certain features. You know, it tends to a violent response. America's a gun culture. You know, when COVID broke and various countries around the world were deciding what are essential services, the Americans were out buying guns. Now, you know, the British police aren't even armed, which is completely unthinkable for an American. And their level of, Rabbi Taylor, do you know that there's more than one mass shooting a day in the United States?
Yeah.
Do you know that in the last year there were more than 300 mass shooting defined as more than 4 people being killed at a time? You know, countries around the world look at that and they have trouble understanding, you know, where does that come from? But I'm not a sociologist who can competently analyze the overall situation, but I think you can see why Americans are angry at the police responses. And you could probably understand why the police feel that they need to be, you know, not take any chances. You're dealing with an armed. So it's a thorny problem. I think the solution to the American problem is probably a large-scale, time-bound sociological change. I don't think it's an immediate, narrow political decision. I think it's probably a cultural issue which may be beyond short-term control. One point, of course, one does note is anger and expressing the anger in the streets is one thing. Using the opportunity to loot and steal, you know, I think that's something we would certainly look down on.
It reminds me of the looting that took place here in London the year before the Olympics. I think it was in 2011. But it's interesting the way you contrast, the way you compare and contrast South Africa and America. That's for sure very, very interesting. Next question from Yvonne, different subject. Viktor Frankl at a memorial in Vienna said there's no such thing as collective responsibility. There were also good Austrians who helped Jews. Yet we are told to remember Amalek and the sins of the father. What is the Torah view on this?
That's a great question. I'm not sure we agree with Viktor Frankl, although we agree with him on certain points. You know that the Torah is built on group identity and group responsibility indeed. Not to get confused here, obviously free will and legal responsibility is an individual thing. There's no question about that. In fact, amazingly, one of the opinions for the Torah not mentioning the world to come, as you know, and I'm sure a lot of your members will know, the Torah never explicitly mentions the resurrection of the dead or the world to come. Fascinating question why that is so. And there are many, many answers to this question. But one of them is this, that the world to come is an individual thing, not a community. The Torah speaks to the community. When the Torah promises consequences of mitzvahs, you follow my statutes, fulfill my mitzvahs, I promise you, says God, you'll end up in Israel living a peaceful existence, fruitful crops, bounty, etc., etc. That's communal. There's no promise to the individual that if you fulfill the mitzvahs, you'll have a good life. Not at all. That's a communal promise. The question is this: why is there no resurrection or reward in the world to come? The Torah is speaking on a communal level. The world to come is totally individual. You're a member of a community, but how you behave and use your free will is totally an individual thing. Having said that, though, the Torah certainly sees you in the context of a community. I express that in two ways. First of all, you see it, in fact, in Torah, you see that when it comes to destroying a nation called Amalek, right, which is a totally anti-Semitic genocidal nation, we posit that at a national level. That's interesting, and that's a challenge, but nevertheless, the Torah does that. You see that the Jews are held accountable as a nation. By the way, Rabbi Taylor, we often question that and wonder, how can it be fair that we all judged as a group? The non-Jewish world doesn't have that problem at all. They see Jews as Jews. There's no question. You know, there's a fascinating insight into this. During the Dreyfus trial, you know, there was a the anti-Semitic event that took place. There was one of the defending lawyers spoke to one of the leading rabbis at the time, and he said to him, you know, I know they're going to get up in court when it comes to, actually it was the Bayless trial, excuse me. It was not, it was a question of a non-Jewish child being killed, a blood libel. So the lawyer went to one of the leading rabbis and he said, you know, they're accusing my client, this Jew, of having killed a Christian child to use his blood. I know one of the things they'll say in court is, they'll get up in court and say, you know why the Jews kill Christian children? Because they don't regard non-Jews as human. They don't regard them as why? Because the Torah says, Atem Kriyim Adam. The Torah says, and our Talmud goes into this, the Jewish people are called Adam, which means we don't regard, Adam means human, Adam, the Adam posture, the Adam reality in the world. We don't regard, therefore, we don't regard the non-Jews as Adam. They're non-human. We don't see them as human. After all, we called Adam. They're not called Adam. How will I defend against such a claim? My opposition will have chapter and verse. He'll show that the Jews call themselves Adam, and they don't. Like, very, very big challenge. Listen to what the rabbi said. He said, the nuance of Adam is singular. We regard ourselves as Adam, meaning one person. That's what's unique about us. We don't regard the non-Jewish nations as one person. Wow. We regard them as multiplicity. The way he put it was this. He said, imagine a man disappears. Imagine a man, no trace, disappears. His wife is distraught. The children are devastated. The neighbors, very upset, but not as upset as the family. Somewhere down the block, people hear about it. Not too upset. They're on the next block, people don't even know. Right? The Jewish people, one Jew is in danger. Mendel Bayless is in danger. The whole Jewish people internationally feel they're under threat. We are one person. When the Jewish people stood at Sinai, the Torah, as you know, switches into the singular. And therefore, the Torah regards us as bonded spiritually into a communal entity. There's no question about that. As I began our interview, and I said, two people in the desert, one bottle of water, that's one issue. But a community threatened, the community has a bonded nature that is totally different. You know, when it comes to ransoming terrorists from terrorist captivity, the Talmud has a discussion about what ought to be paid to ransom the terrorists, because impoverishing a community is a life and death question. The community has a reality as community. This is the origin of the mitzvah to love Jews. You have to love Jews. Now, Rabbi Taylor, you and I know some Jews are harder to love than others. No question about that. But you have to love them. You can hate their behavior, but you have to love the Jew. Finally, I'll tell you this. The great Kabbalistic master, the Arizal, says something astounding. He says, what should your last thought be before you approach God in prayer? You're about to take 3 steps forward and address Hashem. What should the last thought be that crosses your mind before you address God? Love of God? No. Love of Jews. Unbelievable. You're about to make contact with your Creator. The thought you should take into that conversation is how much you love other Jews. Reason? If you approach a parent completely oblivious to the needs of your brothers and sisters, you don't understand the parent-child relationship. If you see closeness with a parent and you're unconcerned about that parent's other children, there's something wrong with your bond with a parent. And therefore, to approach God as a Jew, you approach him with the consciousness of the Jews that you bonded to. And then you focus on your love for Hashem. But there's no question that whether we understand it or not, we are spiritually bonded, organically bonded to other Jews, and therefore that's a reality. I just point out to you, by the way, somebody with a bigger heart feels the bond to all of humanity. It isn't only Jews. We're part of a family of nations. And somebody big enough will feel beyond that too, to the nature of all of humanity and the cosmic reality and God's presence in the world as well. You need to be a big personality. Right? But to feel only for yourself is not appropriate Jewishly. It needs to extend to family and extend beyond that to community. The Torah always defines Jews as individuals, in families, in tribes, as a member of the Jewish people, as a member of the family of nations. And therefore, Viktor Frankl notwithstanding, we regard ourselves as limbs of a cosmic body, and that's a Jewish approach.
Well, wonderful, and very important for us to consider. And moving on to a question from Eric, some on a bit of a personal nature. So he said, I heard you once saying that you were brought up religious but normal. When did this change? Was there a trigger, a book, studies, an event, etc.? Was there a trigger?
Your questioner wants to know when I became abnormal. Well, the truth is, my personal story is that, like the vast majority of South African Jews, I was raised extremely traditional. We have some of this in common with British Jews as well. Extremely traditional. We always thought of ourselves as Orthodox. I would say in South Africa, more so than the British community. As you probably know, in South Africa, there's no conservative movement at all. There's a small reform movement, but there's no conservative movement. The nominal definition, self-definition of South African Jews is basically Orthodox. You might not live an Orthodox lifestyle. You might live a lifestyle that conforms more to what the conservative position might be, but you'd be horrified to be called anything other than Orthodox. The community institutions are all Orthodox. Every synagogue has a valid Orthodox rabbi. The kashrut standards are, there's no question that it's a very, very loyal Orthodox, I would say, ethos. And therefore I was raised, I went to a Jewish day school, which was a Zionist, non-religious Zionist day school, but everything was 100% kosher. There was total respect for all the halachic parameters. My grandfather was a rabbi in Cape Town. I mean, not a practicing rabbi, and he was a learned rabbinic personality who'd come over from Lithuania, like most South African Jews. And so I had a very good start from a religious perspective. Although I didn't know the technicalities of learning, I wasn't technically religious, so to speak, but extremely, extremely traditional. I mean, our home was kosher. We were, regular shul goers. I mean, so the step from a secular Jewish lifestyle in South Africa to an observant lifestyle is a much more comfortable. To tell you the truth, I never really made any radical decision. It was all a very gradual growth among a very supportive community. True, one day I had to walk into the hospital, put a kippah on my head, get a few stairs. I mean, that was a step, so to speak. But I was very proud of my, Jewish knowledge and observance all the way through. I was a medical officer in the South African Defense Force. I had to stand up for my religious identity and rights, which were very respectfully accommodated. So the adjustment for me was a very gradual one. After high school, I started seeking Talmudic education. I wanted to know what that was about. There was a movement in South Africa at the time of knowledgeable religious figures, interestingly, mostly from Gateshead, who had formed a kollel in South Africa. Rabbi Ziskind, who lives in London now, was part of that. They very warmly brought us in, exposed us to a real Shabbos experience. When I completed my internship in medicine, I went to Israel to explore some Talmudic yeshiva learning. I learned half day and studied in yeshiva half day. My brother-in-law was running a medical practice in Jerusalem at the time, and he had an offer to run a hospital department in Jerusalem. He told the people offering him the job that his practice was too busy, but he considered doing it if they allowed him to share it with another doctor. They agreed. So I was imported. I used to take care of the patients in the morning while he was running his practice or studying in yeshiva. We'd then have lunch together and hand over the medical problems. And I would then go and study in yeshiva while he took care of the patients. So for a number of years, we were able to run a medical practice half-time while studying in yeshiva half-time as well. And eventually I moved into full-time yeshiva study in order to become more competent, took a special interest in medical halachic area. But I would say I never had a radical, unlike some Israelis who come from a very secular background and sort of radically change overnight. My own process was a much more gentle, sort of more natural, organic growth. My sister followed the same line. My mother went back to her father's rabbinic, sort of practice, made it very easy. My father was a very successful doctor. And when I became interested, he was thrilled, went out and bought me a set of the Talmud immediately, used to attend my lectures, That's the old South African Lithuanian respect for the religious Lithuanian aristocratic Torah tradition, So in my own case, it wasn't really a challenge. It was a natural organic growth. And I was part of many young people who made that move.
It's a lovely story, especially how you did the job share with your brother-in-law. And so what was it like when your father bought you that first shas? He was proud to do it. He was.
Well, to tell you the truth, my first move at that time, I was a third-year medical student, and Jewish observance, and particularly Shabbos, sounded amazing. Shabbat, where you could chill and relax. Well, my father was having none of that. He said, "Listen, if you're going to be religious, you have to do it properly." Went out and bought the Talmud and made me study with him every Shabbat. Every Shabbos we sat in the afternoon, and believe it or not, we went through Shimshon Raphael Hirsch on the Parsha. Now, Rabbi Taylor, that's a long commentary. We went through the whole commentary. My dad made me study it with him. This is not for goofing off. This is for taking seriously. Also had very mature, I went to my local Orthodox rabbi. His name was Rabbi Zachik at the time, about keeping Shabbos. He said, take it easy, take it slow. Don't jump into things that are too much. Let's go step by step. The very mature advice. So, I had no resistance from my family. They were very, very proud of that. And there are many countries, I think, where that would cause attention in a family. Israeli families, perhaps some American families. You put your son through medical school, has great promise the way you see it, and the kid wants to become religious, but many of my contemporaries, that was seen as a positive move, seen with respect. They made it easy for us, So that was my personal story.
Final question, which actually comes from me. You've touched a little bit on it, but question is this: who are the main people who influenced you in your life and who continue to inspire you today? Who would you say are the main few people?
No, I tell you, that's a long, long, long discussion, and I could pick out so many. I mean, my main Torah teacher was Ramosha Shapira. Before that, I was strongly influenced by Rav Simcha Wasserman, one of the greats of the last generation. Our families actually were cousins, so I had special sort of access to him. But let me just, for the interest of I could point to so many people, my own parents, of course, but let me pick out one that I think your members will find interesting. I was very heavily influenced in medicine by an Indian physician and internist in the apartheid era in South Africa. Very briefly, I don't know how long you'll give me to tell you the story, but very briefly, this Dr. Veriava, who was now you probably know that in South Africa, the Indian and Asian community was classed as non-white, which means black. In other words, the apartheid laws apply to them too. So this Indian man, who was very sophisticated, a highly intelligent, brilliant physician, and wonderful teacher of medicine, was not allowed to walk into a post office, sit on a park bench, get onto a bus, get onto a train, enter a restaurant. You have to understand what apartheid was. The park benches had signs painted on them, whites only. Now, that's one thing when you're dealing with a gap across the color bar between a tribal Zulu from Natal and a sophisticated, educated white person, but it's a different sort of pain when you're dealing with an academic Asian man who's highly sophisticated, highly trained, a teacher of medicine in the medical school, and a social, my academic superior and my social inferior. So he was an individual. Of course, he worked in a colored and black hospital. Black doctors were not allowed to touch white patients. So he ran a department. I was a medical student in his unit, and I decided to do my internship with him because he was the best medical teacher I ever had. I worked in his ward. He trained me in medicine. There were days where he disappeared because the security police took him away for brutal questioning because he was an anti-government dissident. And on at least one occasion, he saved my life. I'll tell you the story briefly, is that when I finally completed my internship and took leave of him, I was posted by the South African Army to Southwest Africa, which was a place where a terrorist border war was going on. In fact, the first day I arrived there as a medical officer, 2 of my friends were shot. One died, one survived. There was a terrorist guerrilla warfare going on. Because of the warfare, there were no consultants in the hospitals. So they put me, a newly minted doctor, 1 year out of medical school, in charge of a big tertiary hospital in Windhoek, dealing with the most complicated medical cases way beyond my competence. I used to examine the patients, run to the hospital switchboard, put a call through to Johannesburg to Professor, my teacher, Dr. And he would tell me what to do, and I would treat the patients. On one occasion, we had a typhoid epidemic in the ward, 30–40% mortality, desperately serious disease, highly infectious. One night, 4 o'clock in the morning, I finally collapse in bed and I'm trying to get to sleep. I'm feeling very, very bad. And I have my hands on my abdomen, and as I breathe, I feel my spleen knocking against my hand, big enlarged spleen, typhoid, very dangerous illness. What was I going to do? The rules required me to see a military doctor. I wasn't going to see a military doctor. They were worse than me. No way I was going to do that. So I crawled into my commanding officer. I told him, listen, it's Passover coming up soon. You have to give me leave. He gave me the leave for Passover. I basically crawled back to South Africa, 1,000 miles. Who was going to treat me? Illegal to be treated by a non-military physician. I snuck into the black hospital to see my teacher of medicine. Illegally, not allowed to lay a hand on a white patient. Of course, he examined me, he treated me. It was a very, let me finish with this. Only recently, he came back into my life for various reasons, but we made contact again. And I had the great privilege and honor of giving a lecture to the whole Johannesburg Medical School recently on a Jewish medical ethical topic. But I began with an introduction of a praise of his, speech about his life and how he influenced us and taught us medicine and what he went through. I was speaking to a generation of young South Africans who've not lived through the apartheid era, and he was present. He was the chairman of the event. It was a great honor and privilege to be able to acknowledge, his teaching and his courage, what he went through, during the difficult apartheid eras, to teach. You have to understand what that means. Here's a person who is has everything against him for no reason at all, teaching a young white Jewish doctor who has all the privileges, and during the entire experience never mentioned one political word ever. That wasn't his agenda. His agenda was teaching us medicine, completely rose above the political situation. She asked me, he trained me. My medical thinking to this day is formed, by the training that he didn't teach me medicine. He trained me as a doctor, the way you think, the thoroughness and the methodical nature of medical diagnosis. So I owe my medical personality to that individual. Just one of many people who influenced me. Wow. I thought you might find that interesting.
He inspires you, and Rabbi Tatz, you continue to inspire us, our community, and indeed the entire Jewish world. Thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you continued Hatzlacha, continued success. Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi Taylor. Best wishes to you and your community. Thank you.